In this video, I provide a quick overview of some of the exercises that you worked on from the chapters on nouns and pronouns, and I just outline the first couple from each exercise. And if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me, but hopefully this gives you a way to think about those exercises to help you learn. So in the chapter on nouns, it talked a lot about faulty plurals, and a lot of these you just need to look up. So in this example, father-in-laws is actually an incorrect way to make it plural. And so one of the things you might do is if it looks funny, it might get flagged by spell check if you're editing in an electronic format. But if it looks weird or the word looks kind of weird, just look it up. So when in doubt, always look it up. So here you would find that hyphenated words like this, like cul-de-sacs, is actually culs-de-sac. So there's a lot of these different words in English. And so in this case, father-in-laws is actually fathers-in-law if you're talking about multiple fathers who are fathers-in-law. So that's just one example of faulty plural forms. And on a lot of those, you just need to look them up and kind of get used to which ones are funky and that you always need to check on. So in exercise 3, it was talking about faulty possessive forms. And in this exercise, you needed to think about which was the possessive and how to form it. So in this example, we have Jones and Pixley's is one of your possessives. You have the DC schools is another possessive, and you have student athletes as another possessive. So the error actually though is with Jones and Pixley. So this is a single entity law firm. So Jones and Pixley is the law firm, and if they were each filing a brief, then it would be Jones and Pixley's. So in this case, if you want to read them as separate entities. But in this sentence, those are actually one entity. And so you would actually form the possessive just with the second part of that sentence or that phrase. And so to be Jones and not possessive. So Jones and Pixley's briefing. And again, what that indicates is that those aren't two separate entities, but one single entity. If you were talking about two individuals filing two individual briefings or doing two individual things, then you would form the possessive with both of those things. So then with DC schools, that's a plural noun. So it's talking about the DC schools, all of them. And so that would be possessive on schools. And then with the student athlete, that's a singular entity, the student athlete. And so that would be a singular possessive with the athletes there. So the final exercise from the noun chapter that I wanted to review was problems with count and non-count nouns. And a lot of these you might just catch because they sound a little weird to your ear, but you could double check them or just try different things. So in this first sentence, it says, a wage board may differentiate and classify employment in any occupation according to the nature of the service rendered and recommend appropriate fair wage rates for different employments. And employment is one of those words that you don't have multiples of, so you would just say different employment. And actually that sounds weird, so you would need to insert kind of a phrase to indicate that there are different kinds or types of employment. So you'd say wage rates for different types of employment. And this is frequently the way that you make non-count nouns countable, is that you insert some kinds of phrase before the noun to make that plural. So if you talk about rice or milk, for instance, you would say grains of rice or cartons of milk. Research would be research studies. So you would add something to it to be able to make that part plural. In the second one, we see a different slight variation of the problem. So I'm going to skip the first part of the sentence and just move down to the last part, which is the mission variable is consistent with the proportion of those type of accidents that occurred over the earlier periods. So again, accident is when you have it with that type of phrase, it is singular, but you would make the type the plural part. So those types of accidents, those types of accidents, that would be plural. You would just have to, though, because it's talking about multiple types, you'd have to insert the plural, so those types of accidents. And so again, I'm actually leaving that little misstep of my own in this video so you can see how you kind of can check it. So initially I was like, oh, you just need to make that second part plural, but accidents is a countable verb or a noun. But because it has that type of, attached to it, you want to make sure that that part is also plural. So those types of accidents that occurred over the earlier periods. So the next chunk of this video is focused on the pronoun chapter, and this gave a lot of people different grief. And so I worked with people individually on this, and I'm happy to always work with you individually on these kinds of things. So just reach out and connect with me. So in the first exercise, exercise 3, the focus was on vague references. And so this is a pretty common error that you find in technical writing, is that often you have a really complicated sentence and then you have a pronoun, and it's unclear what that pronoun refers to. So in this first sentence, we have for heart rate and core temperature, and I would actually put a comma there, the 2 lowest and 2 highest air permeabilities form 2 distinct groups. So we have heart rate and core temperature, and then 2 lowest and 2 highest air permeabilities, and then 2 distinct groups. So there's sort of a bunch of different nouns here. But they, and here it is unclear what they refers to. So you could take a guess and you could replace the they with the noun, but most likely you would query the author and you would take a guess and say, does this refer to heart rate and core temperatures, or does this refer to the 2 lowest and 2 highest air permeabilities? So just keep that in mind. So you can always ask the author, essentially, author, which is they. So you don't want to confirm with the author there. If you can't figure it out, a query is always a good way to ask that question. So the second part, adherence with the protocol was generally good, particularly for the delivery of fluid and vasopressors, but there were delays in obtaining packed red blood cells and domain, whatever, which that the value, so there's like a bunch of these, but then we get before these were delivered. And again, it's unclear what these are. Is it referring to the protocol or the delivery of the fluid and vasopressors? Is it referring to obtaining packed red blood cells and dobutamine, whatever? I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that word at the moment. So again, when it's unclear, you could take a guess if you're editing, but I would always query the author. And in your own writing, this is a good thing to always edit for. And one of the things that I often do is, because it's a really common error when you're writing, you think that it's clear, but when you go back and read it, you might start to see how it's unclear. So the next error, or the next exercise, was focused on the errors in pronoun cases, and this is where folks got a little bit confused. And so remember, when it's talking about gender, it doesn't just mean he, she, and they. When you're talking about that and which versus whom, those are genders as well. Or I would say who and whom. So that and which is referring to inanimate objects. Who and whom refers to animate objects. So anything that's a person or an animal or a living entity would get a who or whom. And that or which would go with your non-living entities. So in this one, unlike the dependency checking for the TCID report, the component interdependency report had one target customer. So this is a relative phrase, so it's a relative pronoun, and it's describing customer, and customer is a person. So who is the correct form there? And this is also offset with a comma because this phrase is extra information. You could take it out and it would make sense. So the component interdependency report had one target customer who I met with frequently for this report as well. So you could technically take out that phrase. It just adds additional information, which is nice. But the main idea there is the target customer. But since we're referring to people, we would want to use who instead of which, and it would keep the comma because it's non-restrictive or inessential, essentially, or non-essential information. The second pronoun you get is the who I met with frequently. So this is actually supposed to be whom, but I will tell you that in English we are losing whom, and probably in 50 years no one will use it. And right now, if you use it, it sounds really stuffy and formal. And there's a reason for that, which is that people in normal speaking don't really use whom very often unless they feel like being especially pretentious or stuffy. So in an editing situation, you can make a rhetorical choice to leave out the whom, and I frequently do in my own writing. and when working with other people. However, if you're in the kind of rhetorical situation that values prescriptivist ideas of language, which is that idea that there's particular rules and you must always adhere to those rules, then you would want to edit the whom's in, because that kind of reader or that audience will expect you to adhere to the formal rules of grammatical standard written English. So just keep that in mind. So here it's whom is the objective case of the relative pronoun. And so the way to kind of signal this is if you see a preposition, so I met with him frequently, if you rearrange the sentence, or I met with her frequently, or I met with them frequently. So when you have it as a relative pronoun, it should signal to you that it's in the objective case. So this is just one of the things that I would stop to check for. And when it comes to who versus whom, you probably will always need to stop and check for it, and that's okay. So just be conscious of that and look it up if you need to. It's okay to stop and look up things. All right. So the next part is former shuttle astronaut Dan Barry continues to plod through Survivor Panama, and there appears to be little threat of him being voted off the show anytime soon. And if you saw this him and thought, oh, that sounds okay, because it's the object of, that's a completely common error, and in fact most readers would read this and not really think too much of it. But in this case, the threat is not of him, it's of being voted off. So that's the actual object of the preposition, and the him here is possessive. So often the trick for this one is if you see that ing form, then it often indicates that the or the pronoun that goes with it is a possessive pronoun. So it could be your or his or her or their. And that's just one way to kind of check for it, is if you see that ing form, maybe pause and see what the pronoun should be. So continuing looking at pronouns, there's two things that I wanted to talk about here, and one was something that was actually brand new to me, and the other was a little bit of a complication with sentence structure. So in the first example, the sentence authentication is a process that confirms a user's identity before he or she can access the network. The rule of thumb is that a pronoun is supposed to match the referent when it's in the possessive case. So because users is possessive, he and she, the pronouns, are supposed to also be possessive, except that you can't actually make them possessive because it would mess up the sentence. So the fix here is to take users and make it not possessive. So because it's easy, there's two ways to make things look possessive without using a possessive pronoun. What you would do is you would take out users, you would then go identity of the user, and that's a way of indicating possession without using the possessive case pronoun or possessive case noun. And then he or she, because the user is singular, matches, all is good, we've got everything fixed. I'll let you know that this error was brand new to me. This is not something that I had really thought that much about. And honestly, most people would probably read the sentence and not see any issues with it. So this is one of those prescriptivist rules that you want to be conscious of. But again, you can opt to edit according to the rhetorical situation. So be aware of it, but maybe consider where and when it's appropriate to edit for this. The second one is a little bit of a tricky situation. So I wanted to just jump to the end of the sentence, so starting with and there. And so, and he was glad that it was them and not him. And when you see that it, there's your subject, was is your verb, you think, oh, them and him are operating as objects. However, was here is a linking verb. And so what comes after it is actually a subject complement. And you see this when you have some sentence that has a subject and the to be form of the verb, and what follows is actually describing the person. So the phrase, I am happy. I is the subject. Am is the verb, but happy isn't the object of the verb. It's actually a subject complement. It's describing my state of being, so it's describing me. So in this case, it was them and not him. Them and him is describing it. It's the subject complement for that. So it'd actually be they and not him, because it's not the object of the verb. It needs to be in the subjective case. And the way to remember this too is back when I was a kid, they told you that you're supposed to reply, "This is she," if somebody called me on the phone and said, "Hey, is this Jen?" And I would say, "Yes, this is she." And I don't think I really knew that until I understood that that's how what was going on in that sentence was about the subject complement. So she in this case is describing this. It's providing more information about the subject, thus being a subject complement. It can't be in the objective case because it's not the object of the verb. It's instead in the subjective case. So that's just something to keep aware of also while you edit for those kinds of errors. So the last exercise covered relative pronouns. And the thing to remember about relative pronouns is that there are that and which and who and whom and a few others. But typically that is restrictive. It means the information is needed to understand the content of the sentence, which is non-restrictive or non-essential. And who and whom can operate in both. With the non-restrictive ones, you use a comma. So the offset with a comma helps you understand that it's a non-restrictive phrase, that you could remove that chunk from the sentence and the sentence would still make sense. So in exercise 1, or for the first one, on the other hand, simulation is the execution of a model which has the possibility, and there was some stuff that I took out, to represent its behavior. In this case, if we took out which has the possibility, so on the other hand, simulation is the execution of a model. It feels like you need that extra information because it's the model that has the possibility that helps you understand what model is being simulated. So you wouldn't put a comma there. So the tendency sometimes is just to see the which and add a comma, which wouldn't be exactly right. So you would fix the fact that there's a which without a comma, but it doesn't actually deal with the semantic meaning of the sentence, which is that you need the that there in order to help clarify what type of model the sentence is referring to semantically. So in this case, you really need to read carefully for meaning. And sometimes in these exercises, we have one sentence by itself, and it's kind of confusing whether or not it's restrictive or non-restrictive. So in these editing exercises, you have to take your best guess. But in usual editing situations, you have the full document, and so you have the full context, hopefully, and you can make choices based on that. But just keep in mind here that you want to read not for seeing a thing and then fixing the error. You're not applying a rule in a blanket way. Instead, you want to read for meaning. And so read first for meaning before you apply rules. And so in this case, if we've read that, we can't take that phrase out. So we need to change which to that to make it restrictive. So the second part, this stage of reconstruction of Upper Mount Rainier overlaps the most recent period of thick glaciers known as the last major ice age that peaked at 20,000 years ago. So the main meaning of this sentence is talking about the reconstruction that overlaps with the most recent period of thick glaciers. So the information at the end that starts with that is actually extra. Like if you took it out, you would still get the main gist of the sentence. And so instead, we would add a comma, and we replace that with which. So again, it's nice to have that non-essential information, but you don't need it and to make the sentence make sense. So one of the ways that you might see this is that when it's describing extra information about a noun that clarifies what type of thing it's talking about, those are restrictive. But here it's like, here's some extra information tacked on at the end. It isn't really needed because we have other information that distinguishes which ice age happened. We have last major to help us understand what ice age is talking about. So that extra information at the end is just nice, but it's not needed. So it's offset with the which and the comma. So last sentence, however, and remember when you see this however, you probably want a comma there. However, Harvey was no match for the resolve of the people of Texas who came together to help one another during the storm and who continue to rebuild today. So there's actually two relative pronouns there. And you might get tricked into thinking, oh, the who came together to help one another. So it was no match for the people of Texas. And this, what follows is extra information. It's nice, but you don't necessarily need it to describe the people of Texas. And you might be tempted to then switch. So you add your comma, But you might be tempted to switch who to which. But remember, we're talking about people. So the gender of the pronoun needs to be who. So no match for the resolve of the people of Texas, comma, who came together to help one another during the storm and who continue to rebuild today. And so those two things, you would add a comma here because you're joining two things together there. So to split those, so that's two independent clauses, but those are both who, and you just include the commas to indicate whether or not it's restrictive or non-restrictive. So I hope this overview was useful to you. I know, again, the video is long, but you can jump around, hopefully. And hopefully this helps you clarify those different elements about pronouns and nouns that you might encounter in editing situations.